What if I told you that in the middle of the United States, under a sky so clear that every star looked like a lantern hanging above the earth, I found myself staring into eyes that were not human? This isn't a campfire tale, and it isn't something I dreamed up after watching too many late-night documentaries. It happened, and it began on a road that thousands of people drive every day without ever realizing what waits just beyond the edges of their headlights. My wife and I were on a late-night drive, crossing the vast stretches of the Midwest, where towns vanish into the horizon and silence wraps around the car like a living thing. The only company we had was the radio fading in and out and the endless sweep of cornfields. I remember feeling uneasy that night, though I couldn't say why. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you tremble. It was the kind that quietly tells you something is wrong, that you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. The stars overhead looked brighter than usual, almost too bright, and one in particular caught my eye because it wasn't twinkling like the others. It hovered, steady, white with a faint pulsing glow. At first, I thought it might be a plane, but it didn't move like one. It stayed fixed in the sky, directly above us, as though it were watching. I didn't say anything to my wife right away. I didn't want to spook her, but then she leaned forward and whispered, "Do you see that?" I nodded, and in that moment, we both knew something was about to happen. The star suddenly shifted, cutting across the sky in an impossible angle, moving so fast it left no trail, no sound, nothing. Just there 1 second, gone the next, and then, right in front of us, in the field to the right of the highway, it reappeared. A sphere, glowing faintly, as if it were made of glass and filled with liquid light. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small car, but it radiated a presence that was undeniable. I pulled the car to the side of the road, unable to keep driving. My wife grabbed my arm and whispered that we should go, but the strangest calm settled over me. It wasn't curiosity exactly. It was more like being pulled, as if something inside that light was reaching into me, urging me closer. The air around the sphere shimmered, bending slightly like heat rising from asphalt, but the night was cool. There was no sound, no hum, no engine. Just silence, heavy and complete, the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound louder than it should. Then, the light dimmed, and within it, shapes moved. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but the longer I looked, the more distinct they became. Figures, tall, slender, with movements that were deliberate, graceful. Their forms seemed to bend the glow itself, like they weren't fully anchored in the same reality we were. One stepped closer to the edge of the sphere, and for a brief second, I saw a face. Not monstrous, not grotesque, but unfamiliar in every way that mattered. Large eyes, dark and endless, reflecting the stars above. The being tilted its head, watching us, and in that gaze, I felt something I can't explain, like every memory I had, every thought, every hidden truth about myself was laid bare before them. My wife squeezed my arm tighter, whispering my name, but I couldn't look away. Then, without words, without sound, something passed between us. An understanding, a message, not in English, not in any language I knew, but in pure thought, pure knowing. They weren't here to harm us. They weren't here to conquer. They were running. From what? I didn't know. But I felt their fear, their urgency, their desperate need to find refuge in a universe that had turned hostile against them. And just as quickly as the connection formed, it broke. The sphere brightened, swallowing the figures back into its glow. The air pulsed once, a wave you could feel in your chest, and then it rose silently into the sky, accelerating upward until it was just another star among thousands. My wife and I sat frozen in the car, the night suddenly normal again, the field still, the road empty. But nothing would ever feel normal to us again. That night we learned something most people will never truly believe. That the universe is alive with others, and some of them are as vulnerable and lost as we are. We spoke little that week, but we planned a cautious kind of honesty. Not a press conference, not a viral confession, but a measured accounting for people who might help us understand what had happened. We first reached out to a retired physics professor at the state university, a woman my wife remembered from a lecture years ago who'd once spoken about pattern recognition in natural phenomena. She answered after 2 days and one terse voicemail where she admitted skepticism but agreed to meet us, saying only, "If you bring evidence, I'll bring curiosity." We showed her the journal, the photograph from the forum, and the faint circular mark on the back seat that had stubbornly resisted all attempts to scrub it away. She handled the paper like something fragile but important, her fingers tracing the concentric impressions as if reading Braille. Then she did what scientists do. She asked for measurements, for the exact times, for any instruments we had that might have recorded electromagnetic anomalies. We had little to offer in the way of instruments, but we had observations. The steady star that didn't twinkle, the liquid glass quality of the sphere, the way the light bent the air. She nodded as if taking these in, and when she spoke, it was measured and patient. "There are phenomena we call transient luminous events," she said, "and others that sit at the edge of what our instruments can detect. I don't know what you saw, but the physical imprints are data, and data wants to be compared." She arranged for a small team, a graduate student with a background in materials science, a postdoc who specialized in signal analysis, to visit our town under the pretense of surveying local light pollution for a study. They brought a van full of equipment that looked far more commonplace than it felt: spectrometers, thermal cameras, magnetometers. At first, their tests turned up nothing remarkable: no radioactive spikes, no obvious chemical residue. The magnetometer hummed like a careful insect and then returned to the baseline. The thermal images showed only the cool night and our two tired faces. But the material scientist, a young woman with hair pulled into a tight knot, asked to take a sample from the seat imprint and from the smear of frost in the cupboard. Under her microscope, the particles looked like glass dust and something crystalline that refracted light in ways we couldn't describe. She marveled at the orientation of the crystals, which suggested a rapid cooling event from a highly ordered state. "This isn't from Earth, not in the way we produce materials," she said quietly. And in the way she said it, there was a tremor of wonder that felt like an echo of the first night. News of the small team's visit leaked into the local grapevine. How it couldn't help but leak surprised me, but secrets in small towns rarely stay buried. A reporter from a regional paper called with gentle curiosity and a request for an interview. A podcaster who specialized in fringe science sent a long, excited email. We declined public interviews. We weren't ready to be a story. The more we refused, the more insistent people became, and that pressure itself became a kind of weather, affecting how neighbors treated us, how friends made jokes across the fence. Some were kind and believed us without spectacle. Others kept their distance as if proximity might invite something uncanny into their lives. The professor told us not to expect a tidy explanation. "Sometimes the universe hands us a fragment," she said, "and all we can do is catalog it, compare it, and let it teach us what it will." Her team scanned old radio logs, archived telemetry from nearby amateur observatories, and a surprising patchwork of data from cell phone sensors that had been uploaded during the nights around our sighting. Pattern recognition is like archaeology. You sift, you overlay, you look for recurring shapes in scattered fragments. And gradually, a pattern emerged: small, localized events clustered in rural corridors, often near farmland and away from major radar arrays. The descriptions varied. Some spoke of lights, others of a feeling of being watched, but a recurring physical signature persisted: transient imprints on organic surfaces and brief, localized cooling followed by a specific crystalline residue. As we pooled reports, a map unfolded showing a thread of sightings running across several states, almost like a seam stitched through the map of the continent. It was tempting to imagine intention, routes, migration paths, but the professor cautioned against narrative hunger. "Correlation is not causation," she reminded us. And yet even the phrase felt inadequate beside the raw human urge to make meaning. Meanwhile, the changes inside me deepened in ways that were both small and irrefutable. I found myself humming melodies I'd never heard before, able to sketch geometric shapes that had no name in any book I owned, and waking with the faint taste of salt and lavender on my tongue, though we had neither in the house. My wife experienced her own shifts. She became attuned to patterns of light that others dismissed, and she started to dream of landscapes that were not on any map. Our private lives reconfigured around these intrusions. Intimacy altered because we carried something the rest of the world did not. And even when we crossed our fingers and pretended to be the same couple who loved long car rides and bad television, there was a reserve between us, an awareness that we were guardians of a secret too large for ordinary jokes. Strangest of all, on nights when the wind was right and the sky held its breath, I would hear a thin, high note in the far distance, like a violin string plucked by glass. The sound was never audible to anyone else, and it came with no pattern I could predict. Once, standing in the doorway with my coffee cooling in my hands, I felt that same pull I'd felt in the field, patient, urgent, like a hand at the base of my skull urging me toward a decision I had not yet named. I resisted the compulsion to tell the team everything I felt. Some things belong to the interior, to the parts of ourselves that are less researchable. But I also saw what restraint had cost others in the past, stories left to sour into rumor, lives derided. So I told the professor what had passed between us that night. The sense that they were not invaders but fugitives, that they had been cataloging us as fragile neighbors in a vast, indifferent universe. She listened without flinching and then asked a question that lodged in me like a seed. If they returned, would you meet them again? The question felt like a hinge turning. I didn't know the answer then, but I knew that whatever came next would demand a choice between hiding and opening, between fear and the odd, dangerous possibility of trust. We decided to answer the question the professor had asked, and the decision to step toward the unknown felt less like courage and more like the removal of a bandage, inevitable and tender. We arranged a meeting the way you arrange something that must look ordinary. A late drive to the same stretch of highway, a mutual agreement to keep headlights low, to sit in the car and wait. My wife and I rehearsed nothing. Rehearsals felt too human, too scripted for whatever language of presence had touched us. The team agreed to be nearby, but out of sight. They would monitor with instruments and keep the record straight, but they would not interfere. The night we chose was skeletal with stars, cold enough to see the breath lift from our mouths in little ghosts. I felt the old, quiet tug before the light arrived, the same internal compass that had drawn me from the car months earlier, and this time I did not fight it. When the sphere descended, it did so slower than memory had made it, and with a gentleness that felt deliberate, as if it too had rehearsed the manner of approach. It settled in the field, a bead of light hovering above the ground, and this time there were no figures visible from the periphery. Instead, the light seemed to fold out and create a space like a small chapel. The air tasted faintly metallic and of citrus, a scent that had no business in that Midwestern night. I stepped from the car before my wife could stop me, and the ground under my boots felt as if it were made of very fine glass, solid, and yet giving in a way that suggested an elasticity I could not name. The light pulsed once, and then the same invisible thread that had reached into my head months ago braided itself through me again, only stronger, clearer, as if we had both learned the grammar of attention in the interim. This time the communication was not only images and feelings, but a shape of thought that folded and refolded until I could hold it in my hands like a paper crane. They showed me a map of their leaving, not a military retreat or an act of aggression, but a collapse of habitat. Their home had been a lattice of light and currents, and something, climate, entropy, a predator we could not name, had made it unlivable. They rode currents between stars, narrow, dangerous passages where navigation demanded more than instruments. It demanded an attunement to the hum of existence itself. When that attunement failed, they were cast out like seeds blown from a tree. They were not immortal. Their bodies, such as they were as fragile as moth wings. That knowledge landed in me with a tenderness so sharp it made me dizzy. In exchange for refuge, they offered something small and exquisite, a way to listen to the edges of things. They taught me, in the manner of images that folded into instructions, how to tune a radio not to stations but to the breath of local ecosystems, how to listen for the low, slow rhythm that marks the health of soil and streams. The lessons were practical and absurdly intimate. How to hear when a river is telling you, without words, that a pollutant has started to spread. How to know when a stand of trees is preparing to seed or decay. My wife learned to see the geometry of clouds as if they were pages of a book, while I learned to feel the small electrical signatures that preceded the unusual lights. It was not a download of encyclopedic knowledge. Rather, it was an apprenticeship in attention. The beings seemed to need more than shelter. They needed allies who could help them survive in a place that made no mechanism for beings like them. In return, they stitched small pockets of protection into our lives. Microclimates that cooled the interior of our car during long summers. A crystalline residue that repelled rot in garden soil. A tune that, when hummed at dawn, seemed to help seedlings uncurl with a vigor I had never seen. The professor's team recorded everything: the spectral fingerprints of the light, the crystalline samples, the microclimatic shifts. Their data made the impossible legible, and that legibility changed the tenor of our town from rumor to collaboration. Farmers who once crossed themselves when they saw the lights began to leave jars of water and bread under certain trees at the field's edge. They called them offerings, but what they were, in practice, was food for curiosity, small acts that signaled a willingness to share the night. Not everyone accepted the shift. A few townspeople accused us of courting danger, of inviting an invisible invasion. Old suspicions flare when new stories enter small towns. Fear has a shorthand. We endured a few nights of silent cars idling at the edge of our property, headlights creating a ring of white that felt like a penumbra of distrust. The beings never responded aggressively. Their presence continued to be a study in restraint. Curious, careful, haunted by memories of collapse. They spoke to us, and through us to the professor and to the grad students, about the fragility of migrants, of the strange ethics of survival when entire ecologies fail. They asked for nothing in the terms humans usually understand. They did not want power, they did not want dominion. They wanted space, literal space, and an accounting. The names of species, the pattern of seasons, the locations of safe water. In answering, we learned to be translators between languages of flesh and languages of light. Those nights altered us in subtler ways than the dramatic arrival might suggest. The town's rhythms shifted toward attentiveness. People listened more to the weather, to the way the creek sounded after a storm, to the color of the corn in August. The professor published a careful paper that avoided sensationalism and instead argued for a new category of transient ecological events, one that deserved study without hysteria. Funding followed, slow and bureaucratic, but real. Instruments, monitoring stations, conservation grants. The presence of the beings forced a reconfiguration of priorities. What had been background, soil health, microclimates, the migration paths of insects, became important in a way that connected with a much larger cosmic empathy. Yet not all transformations were outward. My wife and I discovered that intimacy can expand to include the other without shrinking what we mean to each other. The secret we once feared would ruin us became a shared craft. We learned to read one another in the new ways the visitors had taught us to read the world, and that reading made us fierce protectors of each other and of the fragile guests we had sheltered. The third winter after the sighting, when the frost on the field snapped like old glass, the beings left us a small thing, a shard of light-formed crystal that fit into my palm and hummed faintly when I pressed it to my forehead. It did not speak in words. It offered instead the image of their lattice, collapsing and rearranging, and with that image came an instruction. Wherever the lattice could not sustain them, new lattices could be coaxed into being if attentive hands and patient minds worked together. The professor called it a hypothesis. The farmers called it a promise. For my wife and me, it felt like a covenant. And yet, even with this fragile hope, I learned that some questions remain open. The beings had told us why they fled and given us ways to help, but they could not stay forever in a world whose seasons are written in a language that did not belong to them. The choice before us was not to save them entirely. That was impossible. But to give their passage meaning, to make certain that their flight was not a lonely footnote in a universe that otherwise turned its face away. As autumn crept in that year, the sky took on a certain translucence, as if preparing to show us a new layer of its face. We organized a farewell of sorts, not public but not secret either, a gathering at the field's rim where we had first seen the sphere, attended by people who had chosen to believe in the work instead of the rumors. We did not know if the beings would come for good or if this would be another brief exchange, but when the light rose that night, it felt like an answer to the question the professor had asked me long ago. The night the light lifted for the last time felt both ordinary and impossible, the way endings often do, mundane in their logistics, monumental in what they leave behind. We gathered at the field's edge with the farmers and the professor's team and a small handful of neighbors who had traded skepticism for stewardship. No cameras, no journalists, just people with cups of coffee warming their hands and faces turned toward the black that held the stars. I remember thinking how human the scene looked. People in wool coats shifting their weight, a dog asleep at someone's feet, the distant hum of a town that, for all its interruptions, kept turning. The sphere arrived without ceremony, settling like a pearl on the sea of corn. Its light hummed with a familiar frequency that made the hairs rise along my arms and brought an ache behind the eyes, an ache that felt like gratitude and grief braided together. The beings revealed themselves in a way that had come to feel like honesty, not with grand displays, but with small, exact gestures. They pulled the light into a shape that suggested hands, and one by one they presented objects, tiny filament-like seeds, a strip of crystal, a narrow ribbon of woven light that, when passed into the soil, seemed to change the color of the earth for a moment as if a sunrise had been planted there. They did not speak. They did not need to. We understood, because we'd learned to understand, that this was their way of giving back, of leaving something practical and sacred in exchange for the shelter we had offered. The professor stepped forward and placed a hand against the largest shard they left, and when she did, she started to cry, not out of fear but out of the kind of sadness that shows when someone watches a species make a brave, dignified exit. My wife and I were quiet because the moment demanded it. Words would have been clumsy. Standing there, feeling the small, electric warmth of the shard in my palm, I understood the strange arithmetic of our relationship with the cosmos. We give what we can, and sometimes that gift is simply a place to rest. In the days that followed the departure, the town rearranged itself slowly around the absence. There were fewer late-night vigils and fewer whispered rumors. The professor's paper, careful, cautious, full of hedged hypotheses, seeded further research. Grants approved monitoring arrays in corners of the country where no one had thought to look. Farmers adapted some of the practices the beings had nudged into being. New soil rotations, attentive listening to streams, small communal sacrifices of time and labor to help recover microhabitats. The change was not magical or total. Pests still chewed leaves. Droughts still came on schedule. Life kept its indifferent mathematics. But there was a newly cultivated tenderness in how people spoke of the land and of each other, a recognition that small attentions add up to shelter. For us, the personal alterations persisted. The shard became a kind of archive. When I pressed it to my brow on certain mornings, it offered a bloom of images, maps of lattices, the names of weather patterns in a language that made sense only in glimpses. It never offered answers to the greatest questions: who created them? What lay at the dark edges of their routes? Whether they would survive in the long run? But it offered a practice, an invitation to care. I kept our journal, thickening it with the slow accumulation of notes and measurements, and, more importantly, the little human things that data can't fully memorialize. The smell of rain after they left, the way the light in our kitchen seemed to hold a softer edge, the jokes we allowed ourselves to tell again, because shelter had a way of restoring ordinary courage. Friends drifted back into our lives, some drifted away. A few people in town never stopped fearing that attention of any kind invites more attention, and in their fear, they found reasons to move on. Those departures hurt less than I expected. Time, like landscape, reshapes itself. and new neighbors arrived who found in our story a reason to pitch in rather than turn away. Years passed, measured in seasons and in the gradual normalizing of the small miracles the beings had left. The grad students finished their dissertations. The professor became an unlikely public voice for a cautious, science-minded compassion, and our field, once a stage for an impossible visitation, grew corn that tasted, people joked, a little sweeter. Sometimes, on the anniversary of the first night, my wife and I drove the highway and pulled to the shoulder, not out of hope for spectacle, but out of habit and remembrance. We would sit in the dim car and listen. More than once we heard, far off, a thin, high note like a string plucked in an empty room. But the nights passed without the sphere's return. That absence, in its own way, taught us to become the kind of people who can live with mysteries without letting them consume us. The final lesson the beings gave, perhaps the most human of all, was not in the crystals or the microclimate shifts, but in an ethic they modeled by their very vulnerability. That asking for help is not shameful, and that receiving it requires courage. They taught us that glide paths between species, between planets, between ways of being, are not only about survival, but about the work of mutual attention. In the end, the story did not become famous beyond the region. It did not change governments overnight, nor did it rewrite textbooks in a single semester. What it did do was quieter and, I think, more enduring. It bent a handful of people toward care. It taught farmers to listen to soil, scientists to hold wonder without spectacle, neighbors to leave jars of water without performative intent. For my wife and me, it changed the axis of our private life. We learned to carry a greater humility and a greater willingness to act when the world asks for help. On clear nights now, when the sky hangs like a lantern ceiling, I still look up and whisper thanks, not because I believe our small kindness saved a species, but because sometimes the right thing to do is the bravest one you can imagine. Open the door and offer a place to rest.